You're listening to the Mind Over Murder podcast.
My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group, together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas.
Welcome back to Mind Over Murder. I'm Bill Thomas.
And I'm Kristin Dilley.
Welcome to the new reality. Coronavirus. Quarantine. Social distancing, expressions I'd never heard of until this week. We live in strange times.
We really do. This has been quite the crazy school year. As Bill knows already, there's a lot more backstory to that than I'm willing to get into right now. But a 2-week quarantine with mandatory school closures is really just about the icing on the cake for this school year for me.
If you're new to Mind Over Murder, Kristin Dilley is a teacher, an English teacher, and a very fine one.
Well, thank you.
But she's on hiatus now.
Yes. We currently have a 2-week school closure here in Virginia. All K through 12 schools are closed by order of Governor Northam. So we spent a very panicked Friday getting together all of our lesson plans for our kids for the next 10 days. I have no idea what's going to happen with the rest of the school year and where we go from here, but really it can only go up from here. At least I hope.
Up here in beautiful Connecticut, we seem to be having an early spring, which is a little weird. Trips to the grocery store over the last couple of days have been, shall we say, an adventure. And
yeah, I'd say that's a fair estimate.
Small town Connecticut here, you've got to go out and get your provisions, and you have to go to the dump. There's no trash collection here. Mm-hmm. And that's a big social thing, although we found ourselves, staying 6 feet away from one another. Hey, how's it going? Kids are out of school. Yeah, I heard, that kind of thing.
And yelling across the dump at each other. Yeah.
Well, and the truth of the matter is, my older brother Richard actually is an epidemiologist and has been for 40 years. The super short version is my brother, who is an infectious disease expert and has worked on most of the major disease outbreaks around the world, he actually said this thing is real. The challenge is that none of us have ever had this virus before. So there's no what they call herd immunity, which is an expression we'll all be hearing more. That makes all of us, young people, middle-aged folks, older folks, susceptible to this new disease. This isn't something to be taken lightly at all. I really think we all need to be taking this very seriously and doing everything we can to limit the spread of the virus so we can flatten the curve. There's another expression I hadn't heard much before.
And I remember teaching during swine flu and H1N1 and SARS, you name it, but I certainly don't remember this sort of panic surrounding it. And certainly we've never had school closures on this level before. So this is I'm sorry, I'm going to have to do the English teacher joke. This is a brave new world for all of us.
Does this mean someday we'll have toilet paper at the grocery store again?
And we have that here, but there was a run on frozen pizza. The frozen pizza aisle was completely decimated the other day. So were the chips. Yeah.
As the guy here, I have to say we are talking about frozen pizza, an essential food group. Especially if you're staying at home, listening to true crime podcasts and catching up on all your reading.
And to that end, if you are practicing this new and wondrous art called social distancing, this is a time to catch up on your true crime podcasts, not just ours. There are many, many other excellent podcasts out there, and there's a lot of great true crime reading that you can do if you are stuck in the house and need something to read.
So one of the things we've been talking about is, what are we going to do with all this extra time that we have? And so one of the things we wanted to ask you about was we would love your input on a question, which is we'd like you to go to the Mind Over Murder Facebook page. We're thinking we may want to do bonus episodes covering some related topics. And we would love your input if there's another case you'd like to have us explore, as well as other related topics that might be of interest to you. Certainly, we welcome your feedback. The Facebook page for Mind Over Murder would be the best place if you said, hey, Kristin, Bill, have you ever thought about covering this topic? And put it out there and let's see how other people respond. We'll certainly take it under advisement and come back to you with some ideas. We have some ideas as well. If we get some yeses from some of our friends, we'll be coming back to you with what I think will be bonus episodes beyond our weekly podcast of Mind Over Murder.
And we're definitely looking forward to spending a little bit more time over the next 2 weeks, devoting ourselves to our true crime research and talking with our friends and creating some really excellent content for all of you.
And just think, it's all coronavirus safe. Listening to podcasts. Good and good for you. Who knew? You never thought about it that way, did you?
Never have.
I came up with that.
Now I'm not going to be able to
think
of it any other way.
Well, I've got a whole new pitch, which is that listening to true crime podcasts like Mind Over Murder is actually good for you.
And there we go. I don't think I can argue with that one bit.
Thanks for listening to Mind Over Murder.
And we'll see you soon. Welcome to Mind Over Murder. This is Kristin Dilley.
And I'm Bill Thomas.
And today we're returning to the case of Gina Renee Hall from 1980. And we are covering the trial of Stephen Epperly.
This ends up being a fascinating case with one of the first no body homicides prosecuted in the country. And it is, am I correct, the first no body homicide in Virginia?
Correct.
Well, let's get right into it. You've done some outstanding research, and we want to learn all about it.
Stephen Epperly was ultimately indicted on 2 felony charges, first-degree felony murder, and abduction with the intent to defile. Once a sleazebag, always a sleazebag. There was an unrelated grand larceny charge in there as well. Epperly's trial was presided over by Judge William Arthur, who was 62 years old at the time and was a highly esteemed judge known throughout Southwest Virginia. He graduated from Virginia Tech, William and Mary, and served in private practice before eventually rising to a judgeship.
I was just thinking if he was still with us, he'd be 102 years old.
I'm glad you could do the math a whole lot faster than I could. In terms of legal representation, Stephen Epperly had to ask for a court-appointed attorney for a couple of reasons. The first one, and probably the most important, is that his parents had paid for his legal representation in both of his previous rape trials in Blacksburg, Virginia. So they would not have been able to cover the bills, the legal bills, that would have mounted from 2 rape trials and then this trial, which would have cost, I imagine, substantially more.
And as we talked about last week, Epperly comes from a pretty modest background himself, and the legal expenses would have been pretty significant in these 2 previous rape trials, where he was found not guilty in both examples.
And in addition to that, a fairly hefty bail for that time period was set at $25,000 in cash or a $50,000 property bond. And neither he nor his parents were going to be able to pay that amount of money. So he was unable to pay bail. He was unable to have it lowered. He did petition to have it lowered. And so ultimately, Stephen Epperly remained in jail until his trial. Now, Epperly had 2 court-appointed attorneys. Their names were Woodrow Lookabill and Dave Warburton, both of whom were in their late 20s, just starting out in private practice. Their law firm had only been established for a year, maybe at that point, but they were doing fairly well for themselves, certainly well enough that Judge Arthur immediately thought of them to be the people who would represent Stephen Epperly. And even though they weren't thrilled by the concept of taking on this legal work in addition to their own private practice and having family obligations as well, they were given the assignment, and they did at that point shut down the rest of their practice in order to concentrate on Stephen Epperly's defense.
It's probably worth noting here that unlike big cities where there might be public defenders who are paid professional attorneys who do that specialty full time, in a small town like this, private practice attorneys would have been enlisted as public defenders as they were in this case.
Now, one of the first things that Lookabell and Warburton asked was for a change of venue for the trial. They contended that because of the huge amount of publicity that this case had generated, that it would have been impossible for Epperly to receive a fair trial in Pulaski County, not only because of the publicity in that small town within that county, but because of the radio and the TV and all of the newspaper stories in the Roanoke Times. So they did move for a change of venue. Judge Arthur did deny that and said pretty much, no, the trial is going to take place right here. This is where it needs to be.
Interesting decision by the judge. I actually think the defense attorneys might have had a valid argument on this one, but the motion was denied, so they moved forward.
Now, let's take a moment and talk about the concept of no-body trials for a minute, because it is an interesting concept to explore. To this point in 1980, there were only 4 U.S. no-body murder convictions, and there were only 2 others worldwide. And what it means to achieve a no-body murder conviction means that you have no body, no confession, and no eyewitness. And of the 2 no-body murder convictions that were done outside of the United States, New Zealand in 1952, and the other was in England in 1955.
To this day, no-body homicides are still relatively uncommon. For instance, we did discuss the recent conviction of Randy Taylor for the disappearance and murder of Alexis Murphy, and that was a no-body homicide as well.
And one of the more famous no-body homicides that a lot of people probably don't immediately think of, one of the murders for which Charles Manson was ultimately found guilty, was a no-body conviction. Manson was convicted of killing Shorty Shea, Donald Shorty Shea, who was a Hollywood stuntman. His body was never located either, and Manson was convicted for that murder. So that is technically a no-body homicide.
If you've seen the recent Quentin Tarantino film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, this murder by Manson of Donald Shorty Shea is directly referenced. They don't refer to him by name. The scene where the stuntman goes out to the Spahn Ranch and encounters the Manson family, that's actually what really happened to Shorty Shea, and he was murdered there, and they believe his body's hidden somewhere up in the mountains near the Spahn Ranch.
A very interesting legal concept that it is relatively rare to have a no-body trial and no-body conviction. So this is, and certainly this is the first for the state of Virginia. Alexis Murphy's was the second. So jumping back into Epperly's trial, it was held at the Pulaski County Courthouse. It lasted 7 days, and it began on December 8th, 1980.
In our research, we were checking no-body homicides. They're still quite rare.
One of the more interesting components of the first 2 days of Epperly's trial was, again, I feel very, very teachery to describe it this way, but the jury was actually taken on a field trip of sorts. It's technically called a view, and they were taken to the various places that would be discussed during the trial. So they were taken to the lake house on Clater Lake, where the crime allegedly occurred. They were taken to the railroad trestle and actually walked across the railroad trestle. And then they went to the Epperly house.
I like the fact that you describe it as a field trip.
Yeah, well, once a teacher, always a teacher, you know. The term is actually a view. Got finished with school, and school is still on my mind, so there we go.
I'm sure they all thought of it as a field trip when they climbed onto the bus.
A 7-day trial is relatively short, especially for such a complex case. The state put forth a number of witnesses, 31 total. And so the first 6 days or so of the trial was nothing but the state's case and a long string of witnesses attesting to the character of Gina Renee Hall, describing all of the myriad amounts of evidence, her clothing, bloody towels, and all the physical evidence that was found. So the first witness against Stephen Epperly was actually called on the 4th day of the trial, and that was his friend Bill King. the person who had been with him that night at the Blacksburg Marriott Lounge, and then later stopped by the lake house when Epperly was there with Gina Hall. He brought his date, Robin Robinson, along to the lake house. Bill King testified about the evening that he spent with Epperly at the lounge. He described catching up with him later at the lake house. And he also described the wet spot on the carpeting, finding Gina Hall's broken ankle bracelet, and about his blind conversation with Epperly when he was at the top of the staircase and Epperly was at the bottom. And he also spoke about the conversation that he had with Epperly several days later, in which Epperly requested for King not to tell the other men at the gym that he had been with Gina on that particular evening.
As we discussed last week, I also think that if Bill King had not gone to the authorities immediately to tell them that Stephen Epperly had been with Gina Hall the previous Saturday night, I'm not sure that Epperly would have ever come forward. He was kind of boxed in and forced to come forward to law enforcement, but I think he was pretty much outed by Bill King right at the beginning of this investigation.
Yeah, I agree with that for sure. He is certainly one of the unsung heroes of this whole entire piece. The court also heard from Robin Robinson. She was Bill King's date on that particular evening, and the two of them went out to the lake house. She also recounted that blind conversation from the top of the spiral staircase, looking downward at Stephen Epperly. But she got a view that Bill King did not get, and this was of particular interest to the jury. Robinson noted that she was able to see Epperly from her place at the top of the spiral staircase, and she revealed that she saw him coming from the direction of the utility room, which is where a number of bloodstains were found. She revealed that he was dressed in a pair of slacks, but did not have a shirt on. And she stated that he was wiping his shoulders off with a blue towel.
Not exactly swimming attire.
Not at all. And you will recall from last episode that blue towel with blood on it was later found along the banks of the New River near the railroad trestle.
I'm shaking my head because even without Gina's body, they were just steadily building a case against this guy. One witness after another after another.
It really is very solid and excellent work on the part of the state in building this. It was one string after another, as you said, of witnesses. The state did a really excellent job sort of building their whole entire case. And so this continued for 6 days until something very interesting happened around lunchtime of the 6th day of the trial. And Bill is grinning because this is a very interesting part of the story, and I know he can't wait to put his 2 cents in on this one. Stephen Epperly and his lawyers left the courthouse through the back door so that they could go across the parking lot and go into the back door of his lawyer's office, where they would go to eat lunch. As they left the back of the courthouse and headed across that parking lot, they saw 2 men who were wearing long wool overcoats walking toward them. They were looking squarely at Epperly. There was no mistake who they were looking at. Because it was a rather unseasonably warm December day, we do get those here occasionally, the lawyers felt it rather odd that these men would be wearing long wool overcoats. Woody Lookabill swears to this day that he caught a glimpse of a sawed-off shotgun underneath the unbuttoned overcoats of both men.
I find this fascinating. As we've discussed, this is one of the many areas of Ron Peterson's wonderful book, Under the Trestle, where in his research, Ron Peterson Jr. has come up with just some amazing stories by way of background. And this one I am completely fascinated by. Who are these guys, or who were these guys, who look and behave like hitmen? Who put them up to this? Who hired them? Were they really going to shoot this guy in broad daylight, kill him and walk away? It sure sounds that way. And then, a television crew from WDBJ7 comes around the corner. They're looking to get an interview with Epperly and the attorneys. The whole thing kind of breaks up. The men disappear. This one, I was just floored when we got to this place because this sounds like a hit. It's understandable with the level of anger in the community directed against Stephen Epperly, who was clearly a predator. It's fascinating to me that someone would actually consider taking this step of gunning him down in broad daylight.
And there is a little bit of speculation in the book about who these supposed hitmen, or I guess alleged hitmen, wannabe hitmen, happen to be. And we're not going to spoil that for you because we very much want you all to go out and buy this excellent book, Under the Trestle by Ron Peterson Jr. It's truly wonderful. And it's a great recounting of this case. But it really goes into who these potential assassins might be. And every possibility is fascinating.
It's one of my favorite places in the book because it's such a weird left turn.
This is really one of those things. Truth is stranger than fiction. You could not make this up.
This is true.
So at the end of day 6, when the state had rested its case, Epperly, who I imagine at this point was quite temperamental, watching the evidence pile up against him and watching all these witnesses come forward against him, Epperly finally requested a meeting in the judge's chambers, at which point he threw his attorneys under the bus. He handed the judge a letter which demanded that his attorneys be fired. And he included a list of items, a rather lengthy list of items of things that he felt had not been done properly or had not been done at all, and stated, under ineffective assistance of counsel, they should declare his whole trial a mistrial and be done with the whole entire thing.
Good luck with that.
So it should be a surprise to absolutely no one that Judge Arthur turned down that request. And so now we want to get a little bit into the forensics of it all. The very last day of the trial, day 7, is the one that featured testimony from a forensic analyst from the Bureau of Forensic Science. Her name was Patricia Hamby. She was brought in to discuss the blood evidence in this case. Now, it's 1980. So, Bill, where are we at in terms of forensics in 1980?
Well, DNA exists, but it hasn't been used in any forensic capacity and doesn't come out of the lab for criminal use until the late 1980s. At this point, all you're really doing is typing the blood. In other words, what type of blood is it and any other characteristics that they can provide. But that's pretty much it. I know all of us have gotten so used to the modern world. This is 40 years ago. And the ability of experts who were as cutting edge and state-of-the-art as they could be in 1980 was pretty limited.
They were able, though, to testify to the fact that the blood that had been found in various places, the trunk of Gina's car, in the lake house, the blue towels from the woods, Gina's clothing, all of these had blood from a type O individual that was able to be testified to immediately. There was also a fiber expert who testified about the fibers that were found in the trunk of Gina's car, and she testified that they were similar to the fibers from the carpeting on the den floor of the lake house and were similar to the fibers from the towels that were also taken from the lake house. So it's about as much of a slam dunk forensically as you were going to be able to get in the 1980s. The final witness for the prosecution was a surprise to everyone, no more than to Epperly himself, who did not at all expect this individual to show up and testify against him. And that was Bill Cranwell, who is a friend of Epperly's, or probably not a friend at that point.
Probably a former friend by this point.
I would imagine very much a former friend at that point, who was brought to the witness stand so that he could testify to one key piece of information. And that was Epperly's incredibly damning statement that he made, in which he said, when you see your brother, a lawyer, Richard Cranwell, when you see your brother, ask him, is there anything they can do to me if they don't find her body?
This, by the way, if Epperly had managed to hire Richard Cranwell, this would have been a good question and would not have been admissible. It would have been covered under privilege. But because he never hired Richard Cranwell and asked through Bill Cranwell, this incredibly damning statement just sits there. When you see your brother, ask him if there's anything they can do to me if they don't find her body.
Understandably, that statement provoked audible gasps throughout the courtroom. If you want a nail in someone's coffin, that is it.
There it is.
With that final statement, the Commonwealth rested its case.
Good courtroom drama there.
There would have been no better note to end on, really. Now, as for the defense, their case was, I would say short, sweet, and to the point, but I don't think even that quite covers it. Stephen Epperly did not take the stand in his own defense.
What a shock.
I would say that's probably a pretty good call. And he was noted for his temper. There had been moments during the trial where he would slam his fist on the table very loudly, startling his lawyers and most anyone else who was in the room at that point. So, I can't imagine an instance in which having him on the stand would have been a good idea.
No, and I could easily see the prosecution knowing his history and his reputation. Remember, his defense attorneys, if they had made the high-risk decision to put Stephen Epperly on the stand, he has to be cross-examined, and there's an opportunity there to keep poking at a witness like Epperly in an attempt to provoke him. And I'm sure his defense team felt that this wasn't necessarily in his best interest, and it certainly would have been a high-risk maneuver.
Very much sounds like it would have been like poking a grizzly bear.
And would you put your grizzly bear on the stand?
Oh, not a chance. But ultimately, his lawyers called no witnesses, and they presented no evidence. Bill, I know you've been dying to talk about this. Go right ahead.
This is one of those things where what do you do when your client is guilty as hell? And how do you defend him or her? One other thing I should mention, too, is that the decision not to put Epperly on the stand, remember that the prosecution in their cross-examination could have asked Epperly about his 2 previous rape trials, his reputation for violence. It would have opened up so many avenues for them that I think it probably was the smart play on the part of the defense not to put Epperly on the stand. As a result, there doesn't seem to be that much balance in terms of presentation. Here you have a week chock full of witness after witness from the prosecution, and then really not much of a defense put forward on Epperly's behalf.
Very, very interesting trial strategy. So ultimately, when the case went to the jury, the jurors were given 3 options to deliberate on. The first option was guilty of first-degree murder. The second option, guilty of second-degree murder. And the third option was not guilty. The difference, by the way, for anybody who may not be aware, between first and second-degree murder is the presence of premeditation and the presence of malice. And both have to be present to make a first-degree murder charge stick.
I'm not sure that Epperly could necessarily have been found guilty of first-degree murder based on premeditation, because I think my read on the situation, reading the book and studying the articles and our discussions, Kristin, I feel like this was a highly violent and impulsive man who would get out of control. I don't really see the premeditation standard is necessarily one that was met, but the malice, I think you could make a case that this guy had participated in any number of violent acts towards women and men and was charged at least twice with rape and had a reputation as someone who had sexually assaulted women repeatedly. So I think that element of malice was probably there. Premeditation, probably not as much.
And certainly that is one concept that Epperly did argue in his appeal, which we'll get into in just a couple of minutes, is that he felt the standard for premeditation had not been met properly. So the case went to the jury. The jury ultimately deliberated for a little less than 2 hours. They got the case at 4:35. They came back at 6:30 and announced that they did, in fact, have a verdict. The actual text of the verdict was this: "We, the jury, find the defendant Stephen Madison Epperly guilty of first-degree murder as charged in the indictment and fix his punishment as life imprisonment."
Never a good sign for the defense when it takes the jury less than 2 hours to find you guilty of a capital crime.
But they did have, I know we've used the term a mountain of evidence a number of times with this and with the Alexis Murphy case, because there was a preponderance of it in both cases. There was a mountain of circumstantial evidence. So I'm not surprised, but you're right, it is never a good thing when you have that short a timeout for a jury. After the trial, Epperly decided to appeal immediately. At his sentencing, he set forth the argument that we actually started with, that he felt he had not received a fair trial in Pulaski County. And he actually termed it as massive publicity. He cited articles in the Roanoke Times, the Southwest Times, the Radford News Journal, TV, radio, you name it. He said there was no way I was ever going to get a fair trial in Pulaski County, and the change of venue should have been honored.
He has a point, actually, on this one. I mean, if I were his attorney, and I'm not an attorney, and I'm definitely happy not to be Stephen Epperly's representative, I probably would have made this argument as well. It's got some merit. And in a pre-internet environment, all the publicity that you just described, Kristin, that's the mass media of the day in 1980. Yes.
And because Judge Arthur did have a reputation as being a fair judge and a reasonable judge, he did take all of that into account. Like, he didn't automatically shut Epperly down. He did think about it. He weighed it, but he ultimately said, we did impanel a fair jury. We're going to go ahead and sentence you now. So he did receive the sentence of life imprisonment. Rather than have the sentencing drag on, Epperly did opt for that early sentencing so he could immediately begin appealing. Now, he did make two interesting, and I would say audacious, requests, both of which kind of make my blood boil, quite frankly. He did ask if he could be allowed out on bail until his appeal could be heard.
In a brutal murder case.
In a brutal murder case. And he also asked if he could spend a final Christmas at home with his family.
This one just floored me. I mean, there's chutzpah, as they would say. And yes. Then this is completely off the charts. Both of these pleadings are ludicrous.
They do speak to a person who feels that he is entitled to be treated in a way differently than everyone else. And there's that sense of narcissism and that entitlement that comes with someone like Stephen Epperly.
Mm-hmm. The sociopath wants to spend Christmas at home with his family before he gets carted off to jail for the rest of his life.
Prosecutor Everett Shockley delivered what I think is possibly the best answer to that. And he said, as far as Christmas, I can only say that Gina Hall is not going to be home with her parents for Christmas. Why should Stephen Epperly?
Well said, counselor.
Bravo. Understandably, at that point, Woody Luckabill and David Warburton asked to be relieved of duty as Epperly's attorneys. And really, at that point, I would be done at that point, too.
Can't say I blame them.
Yeah, he did throw them pretty severely under the bus. And of course, at that point, Epperly agreed, but not before throwing them under one more time and letting the bus maybe roll back over them a couple of times. Gave a letter to the judge stating he did not feel he had, quote, any place close to adequate counsel.
Can you hear me rolling my eyes?
I was saying, you rolled your eyes so hard, I'm surprised they didn't go back into your head. That was great.
Yeah, I got to be careful. My mom would say, you're going to hurt yourself doing that.
Your face is going to stick that way. So Epperly at that point did request another court-appointed attorney for his appeals. And the judge had to have figured that he was going to do that because he had two other attorneys at the ready in the building.
Standing by.
Yeah, he said, yeah, well, okay, here's your other two new attorneys. So Max Jenkins and Randy, it's either Eli or Ely, were the two new court-appointed lawyers who were going to take over. At that point, Woody Luckabill and David Warburton had been working on the Epperly trial for 3 months, and they received a check in the mail for a grand total of $400 each to cover their expenses.
Even by 1980 standards, that's low.
I read that and I was like, is there a digit that's been left off here? This is terrible.
I know. And you hear about attorneys now that are, $500, $600 an hour. These guys got $400 per person for 3 months' work.
So shortly after, on December 28th, there was a memorial service held for Gina Renee Hall. The search for her continued well through the trial, but on December 28th, it was determined to be time to give her a memorial service, both for her and her family and friends. So it was held at the United Methodist Church of Coburn, her hometown, and over 300 people attended this service. There is a monument to Gina Renee Hall at the Greenwood Acres Cemetery in Coburn, and there is every hope in the community still that one day her remains will occupy the empty grave. So sad.
And I think at this point, here we are nearly 40 years later, I think that's an unlikely occurrence, but I understand the community's desire to see that happen someday.
For the next 2 years, Epperly and his attorneys worked on appealing that conviction. They worked diligently, eventually taking that case all the way up to the Virginia Supreme Court, where it was heard on September 8th, 1982. Ultimately, though, the Virginia Supreme Court upheld his conviction. He filed a writ of habeas corpus in federal court in Roanoke, and 4 years later, that was denied. So by July of 1986, he's exhausted 2 appeals in federal court. For the next long stretch of years, Stephen Epperly did nothing but get in fights in prison, moved around several times because he was determined never to really be safe in any place that he was housed. And he continued to appeal his case. And he actually reached a point where he exhausted all of his appeals in a lower court. And so he appealed his case all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, where it was ultimately declined.
Despite his complaints, I actually think Epperly did make use of all of the avenues available to him. He ranted and raved about how he had not received a fair trial, but in all of these appeals, kept bringing up many of the same arguments, and every court system, Virginia, federal, and ultimately the Supreme Court, all felt that he had received a fair trial, and they upheld his conviction.
He is tenacious, I will give him that. To spend 13 years appealing your sentence, I mean, that really is something.
He didn't have much else to do.
True enough.
He had a lot of free time.
True, absolutely true. But interestingly, the saga of Epperly and his appeals process and his parole process does not end there, because Epperly was up for parole in 1994.
This surprised me, by the way, that he would be up for parole under state guidelines only 14 years after being convicted.
Yeah, that blew my mind. It truly, truly did. So Stephen Epperly has been denied parole in 1994, 1997, 2000, 2003, 2006, 2009, 2012, 2015, and most recently in 2018. And every time, the reasons given by the parole board were, release at this time would diminish the seriousness of your crime, the serious nature and circumstances of your offense, and the board considers you to be a risk to the community.
Not exactly a ringing endorsement of this guy.
Not at all. And I was very interested. You want to talk things that floored you. I was very interested at this statement from a former Radford Police Department officer regarding that last reason from the parole board, that the board considers you a risk to your community. So former Radford PD officer had this to say: there are many, many people in the New River Valley who knew Steve Epperly, who firmly believe he is a continued threat to society if he ever gets out. Every single person I have talked to who testified against him at trial or played a hand in sending him to prison believes their life is in danger if he is ever released.
Wow.
The guy is in his 60s at this point.
Yeah, I think we figured out in the first episode, I think he's 67 years old at this point.
And there is a picture of him in the book. You know, you look at him, he doesn't look terribly, dangerous. But of course, looks can be deceiving. Anyone who's ever been fooled by a predator knows that. Given the nature of his crime and given what we know about him and his tendencies as a predator, I fully believe this Radford police officer that this guy is quite dangerous. I wouldn't want to see him prowling the streets, that's for sure.
No, I feel the same way. And the former Radford police officer who said this knew Epperly quite well, and in his observation probably is as valid as anyone who worked the case.
And as we said with Randy Taylor, who continues to withhold the information about Alexis Murphy's body from her family.
Not to mention Samantha Clark's
Yes,
whereabouts.
Thank you. Not to mention Samantha Clark's whereabouts. The same thing is true here of Stephen Epperly. He murdered Gina Renee Hall brutally and still withholds the location of her body so that her family will never have that sense of, I know that we've talked about the concept of closure, but they don't have any answer as to where she is and what happened to her. And that in and of itself, I think, is a good enough reason to keep him in prison for the rest of his life. But that's just my opinion.
I've seen some discussion recently in the UK that murderers coming up for parole who may have served their time should not be permitted to re-enter society without telling law enforcement the location where their victims' remains can be found. And I thought that was an interesting idea.
Yeah, it definitely is. And certainly we both, sadly, know a number of cases in which this would be a huge benefit.
Sure, including the disappearance of Keith Call and Cassandra Haley in the Colonial Parkway murders are still unfound after more than 30 years.
So sadly, Gina Renee Hall's father, John Hall, passed away in 2011 without ever knowing the location of his daughter's remains. And he was laid to rest right next to his daughter's empty grave.
A terrible way for things to end for her and for her family. Her sister Delana had something to say about that as well. She said, "We never had a sense of closure in this ordeal. Not only was our family denied a Christian burial for Gina, it seemed like the appeals just went on and on and on. There was never a moment when we could relax and relish in our memories of Gina's life." And that was Delana Hall Bodmer, her married name.
Who has also written a book about the case and about her journey moving through, trying to live with, because I think really it is just trying to figure out how to live with this awful thing that has happened to her sister.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's a Miraculous Journey, I believe is what it's called. But my heart certainly goes out to her and to every family that's been touched by a horrendous crime like this.
I think any of us could put ourselves in that place and at least get a sense of the kind of loss that the Hall family has suffered and the community at large.
And there are still a number of people in that community who are very interested in locating Gina Renee Hall's remains. There are still active investigations going on, which I think is really something quite laudable, that no one has given up on this. The case is still very, very much on the minds of the people in Radford and around the New River Valley. There are still people who go out and search for her remains. There are, recreational divers who, when they're diving in Claytor Lake, make a point of keeping their eyes open for skeletons that may be on the lake bottom. This is very much still present even after 40 years in the minds of this community.
Mm-hmm. I was struck by the fact that they conducted a search in 2018 on Epperly's property in a basement there. That's only 2 years ago.
This is clearly not a case that is going to go away. I know that you had said earlier that it seems very unlikely that they will find Gina's remains, which is a shame and a tragedy. I think the fact that there are still people in this community who are searching and who are trying to keep her memory alive, that's laudable. And it's a wonderful way to keep her here.
Now, next week, we have the privilege of speaking with Ron Peterson Jr., the author of Under the Trestle, which has been a significant source of information for us in putting together this series on the Gina Renee Hall case. And we get into a real good discussion with Ron Peterson about where Gina's remains might be found. He gets into a lot of really interesting background on the case and how he came to tell this story and where he sees the story going.
So we really cannot encourage you enough to buy a copy of Under the Trestle by Ron Peterson Jr. It is available on Amazon. If you are local, as in here in the Tidewater area in Virginia, you can find it at your local Barnes & Noble. It is really just an excellent book. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I know you did as well, Bill. So we cannot encourage you often enough, please do pick up this book. It is wonderful, and it is probably one of the best true crime reads that I have read this year.
That's saying a lot, especially considering how much true crime you read.
I read probably way too much of it, far more than is good for me, I would imagine. But
Ladies and gentlemen, Kristin Dilley is keeping the true crime business in business.
You're not wrong, sadly. Actually, yeah. There are actually 3 brand new true crime books at Barnes and Noble that I flagged the other day. So, I mean, yeah.
I know when you and I were there a few months ago, you took me over and walked me through everything that was on the bookshelf.
Yeah. Oh no. Actually, this is good. This is good. This is good. That's not so great. No, that's fabulous. You should definitely read that. Yeah. Yeah.
and I've got a stack of them here in my office as well. So we're looking forward to our conversation with Ron Peterson next week, and I think you will enjoy it as well.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder.
Thanks for listening
I'm
to
Kristin
this
Dilley.
episode of I'm Bill Thomas. Murder.
And we'll see you next time.
You can listen to Mind Over Murder on any of your favorite podcast platforms. And a reminder that we're a new podcast, and we very much appreciate your subscriptions and your kind comments and reviews.
Thank you so much for listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll see you next time.
Sources used in this week's episode include
reporting from the Radford News Journal, the Roanoke Times, the Charlie Project, Under the Trestle by Ron Peterson Jr., WDBJ7, WFXR, WTOP, and WY Daily.
Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.
Thank you.